So happy to come back and start this new series of our conversations about open research with researchers from different fields. And today I have the pleasure of hosting Sarah MacQuarrie, who is a senior lecturer in psychology of education at the University of Manchester. And Sarah is going to talk about pre-registration of protocols in qual research. So she's going to share her insights from real-world educational research. I'm recording this conversation and we will be uploading this on YouTube. Sarah, the stage is yours.
Oh, excellent. So good afternoon. It's nice to meet you all virtually. So to give you a little bit of background about me, I'll click forward. I'm a fellow of the British Psychological Society and I'm based at the University of Manchester. So I'm in the Institute of Education within the Faculty of Humanities. And that gives me a really nice opportunity to work with a range of colleagues who are in psychology of education. And we have an educational training programme there as well, the educational psychological training. And we also have teacher education and undergraduate and masters. So that's relevant because it helps prosper all of these different connections and conversations that we have about psychology and education and the relevance for psychology and teasing out some of these knowledge. And one of the best parts of my role is getting to work with my teacher education colleagues who kind of help cross that divide and make sure that we can have real world research that is applied and relevant and has meaning for teachers. So within that today, I'm talking about in kind of three main sections. One about research plans and kind of connecting these worlds and bringing things together, peer review and engagement, and knowledge and community building. So that'll give you a shape of what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to leave plenty of times for us to have questions or maybe an interrogation of anything that I've said at the end. And within that, I think within research plans, it's well worth me doing a quick sense check and the idea of when I started trying to understand more of this world, it was firmly called open science. And it's evolved in the last kind of 4 to 5 years to be kind of marketed as well as open research, making it more accessible beyond this idea of what we capitalise as science, but also for humanities, social science, and the other worlds. By framing it as open research, we're allowing people to see it as relevant for them and to understand that concepts like trustworthiness and openness and transparency has relevance for them in what they're engaging with, what they're writing about, and with their communities as well. So this idea of supporting transparency is a kind of key goal that we see in peer-reviewed publications. But one of the challenges here is knowing if you're in the quantitative world or the qualitative world, how do those two work together? Or if I'm firmly in one area, how can I learn from the other when that is not relevant, for example? Now, I have to say, it's a very interesting phenomena in the UK that we see people as qual or quant, and we kind of routinely label ourselves with this kind of flavour, this kind of theme. Whereas if you go to other countries and speak to other researchers, they have no such qualms. They talk about their work, they talk about their methods, and it's very much an expectation for the person who's listening to get on board with that technique. And I think that's a really interesting one to think about it, that we always have this separation, but it is potentially artificial. We are interested in the research question and using the best method to apply that. And that's a good point to think about. It is an artificial division, and let's think about other ways that we can counter that. So for anyone who's not in psychology, forgive me for the next 3 or 4 slides. Within this, I think it's relevant picking out that psychology has emerged as a discipline in the kind of second half of the 19th century. And here we're thinking about qualitative psychology, which is very much looking at kind of psychological realities as being observable, kind of really started in the 80s and the 90s. And here we have a considerable period of work and kind of burgeoning knowledge and arguments and debates coming forward, particularly led by Professor Erica Berman, who's in my department in Manchester. So that's very much challenging the assumptions in psychology. And a lot of the work in the UK was fueling those debates. They're not just based in the UK, but they're about psychology more widely. And this quant or qual sometimes is kind of refers back to that period as well. To my mind, there should be reciprocity between the two. We should see them as reciprocal. They should support each other and be independent when they need to, but there is a growth possible from each of them working together. So when we're interested in looking at people's subjective worlds and meanings, that was kind of a driving force of this NCRM project that's referred to there, which is very much trying to elucidate what are these standards, what are the qualities that we need to do, how can we help people who want to do qualitative research, how can we shape those parameters. So that's been going on for some time, because that's not a new project at all. And a lot of these challenges and this kind of historical approach to all of this is kind of celebrated in a 2019 article that's celebrated there. What's fascinating is that the QMIP is one of the largest, if not the largest section in the British Psychological Society, and it was only added in 2005. So we're coming up to the kind of 20-year mark, and I'm sure they'll be doing loads to celebrate that. But we also have to think about, we are relatively junior in comparison to the quant world, if you want to frame it like that. And some people might argue about that framing. But we've had considerable work up to this point, but there's considerable work and growth to come as well. And you can see this heralded in certain things. So here we have a 2016 article to the BMJ, pulling out the value of qualitative research and demanding, I think demanding is the right word, demanding more attention and prioritising qualitative research on par, if not equal to quantitative, for the value it can have for different audiences. So that's a huge number of countries arguing. So there's this kind of emerging trend that you can see I'm picking out here, which is qualitative research is often on the back burner for some particular reason. Here we can see a number of range of things that are happening. On the right-hand side, there's two responses to an editorial piece by a new editorial group who've joined the Journal of Environmental Psychology, and they are very much arguing against the quantitative-driven perspectives that were put in this editorial piece by the new group of editors. And that's in environmental psychology, in a world-leading international journal, and an editorial group felt it was appropriate to sell the quant and not even mention qual. So this is a phenomenon that keeps occurring and keeps reoccurring, despite qualitative having a really large and significant contribution to environmental psychology itself. Within that, the Silverstein paper, the Registered Report Survey, gives us a really nice lens about the UK in particular and the evolution of what departments are engaging with to do with open research practices, as they framed it. Both qual and quant are included, which is fantastic. And it shows that there is some variability, with quant being foregrounded sometimes, qual being recognised, but there's still an opportunity and room for growth for these to be more consistently adopted and engaged with. We don't know, I'll need to read the paper again, but I think part of that is also to do with the language and the framing. There's a lot of terminology, a lot of language learning in the open research world, for example. So you can be doing things that are very rigorous, very trustworthy, very open, but you're maybe not using the language that is expected, or the framework is expected in the open research world in one model. The article at the bottom, The Decade of Qualitative Psychology. This is a really nice piece from a set of associate editors from a few years, talking about qualitative psychology and how they have attempted to support an evolution of the writing, of the clarity and the framing that's been put forward in articles, showing that it is an area that has a lot of forces for change in it, and there's potential areas for development and improvement. And as qualitative researchers, we need that support. We need our community to help us better ourselves and give us the opportunity to put things out there like that. So I've talked a little bit there about the area. What we're seeing is this standards for reporting qualitative research from academic medicine is a piece from 2014. So I've chosen one that has a decade of history deliberately to pick out that this is not a new argument. Looking at standards for reporting, looking at a framework for explaining things is no bad thing. And that there are debates about whether we should have these standards in qualitative writing. And there's a really nice review, for example, recently it said, even if you have only partial uptake of these standards, it does help what is included in the publications, which is very much gelling with the Kushner piece there too. Linking into this is this idea of what kind of data collection approaches are involved. Something that's quite challenging in the qualitative world is you expect it to be an interview transcript, or there's this the kind of idea that there's always an interview within it. So we're always looking for verbal dialogue, we're always looking for an exchange, we're looking for a transcript of some kind. So all of these are a form of interview or a conversation-based data collection approach, but they're not all one and the same. They all have their own specialities. Some can have a quant and a qual aspect. So it's all a form of a self-report, but some of it is guided, some of it's very specific and structured, and others are much more open. So each of these would lead to a transcript and perhaps a kind of narrative account as well that would support coding. But that's the verbal side of it. What we then take away the transcript and think about all of the other data collection approaches that could involve. And here I've put on 6, thinking about virtual worlds, to use of photos, to documents and handbooks and secondary data like that, or characteristics of our environment and how we look at codifying those as well. So we have to think about this plurality that's in this qualitative world. It really is there. Now this is, I won't talk about the table long, but it's from a 2018 book. And it really helps if you're not familiar with the qualitative world to think about the method, what we're doing with that, how the gathering structure is the data collection and what that involves, and how then it's managed and how it's also analysed. So you begin to realise that this kind of design, as we call it in psychology, this, whatever the philosophy is that we're approaching a piece of work, that has this pattern across the design of what we're doing and of what we're coming it together. And some of these are at odds with each other, so you'd have to be managing them carefully, but other times they can work together very well and create a kind of family of approaches. Now, this kind of thing, I think, that's at the table is invaluable because it really speaks to the idea that qualitative have as much depth, as much rigor, as much extra considerations as do quantitative work, but we often see them as an interview with thematic analysis, and we don't think about all of the other kind of multi-method approaches that can take place and evolve. My final point here. The other aspect that complicates quant and qual separation is this kind of inherent expectation that science follows a very linear sequential approach. So forgive my oversimplified diagram, but it should speak to that. And what's common about when we're collecting such knowledge is we might follow a linear sequential approach, or it might be much more iterative. And this is something which will vary a considerable deal when we're looking at qualitative research collection and the analysis and the overall trajectory of that work. So we kind of have to take a methodological perspective on the phenomenon that we're interested in and think about how much do we know about it at the starting point, and is it a deductive approach that we're following, or is it much more about listening to the voices of those individuals and working with them and following this more kind of iterative approach. So we have a range of different research programs in qualitative research with a range of different issues that are all tied with theoretical varying frameworks and how they can be partnered together. And that this fluidity within the iterative approaches is often what is most challenging for someone who's more commonly rooted in the quantitative world. And they think of that as being a bias of some kind or a challenge, when in fact it can actually really support an open research process, as I'll go into speak about a little bit more. One thing to pick out is the kind of 2019 formulation of this, which is to do with mixed method designs. Now, mixed method I love as a terminology because it just confuses my mind. For me, combining qual and quant is you're combining them. They are integrated, and these are all integrated approaches in terms of how you can visualize the design. So it's a meaningful approach to having quant and qual in being collected in the same project, as in a nutshell. So the article's great and goes into depth about all of these. I'm going to be talking about some examples of the third one, the exploratory sequential design, and how we collected things using that. But all of these are equally relevant when you've got these two components of quant and qual data and how we come together. And I think that often is a really good conversation starter when you're speaking with people about the different elements of their project, about what is the big picture with this and did you know it at the start? So let me get on to my work then. So I'm talking here about the first attempt that was set up. So this was when we looked at developing and designing a qualitative protocol. So you can see here all of the different elements, and we use the open science framework and the reporting system there to kind of publish them and put them together. So this was trying to investigate a qualitative form of pre-registration before it existed formally, as there now is a specific qualitative pre-registration via the OSF webpage. So this was really about thinking about how we document transparency, how we document decision making, and how all of that is executed in advance of data collection. And I think that's the first kind of premise to think about, is when you're engaging with this kind of protocols, at what juncture are you engaging with a protocol? At what point is your design fixed or malleable? And that's something where qualitative work, it can be unfolding, it can vary much more than in a quantitative design. Something we used there was a qualitative checklist. So we acknowledged and used the 2007 CORIC checklist and used that as a pre-version, because the CORIC one in 2007 was a post kind of submission checklist, if that makes sense. So all of this we had embargoed for a time when we were doing the data collection itself. So it's really interesting and helpful. What we did here that was different to the regular OSF qualitative protocol that's now available is we put in an introduction. I would say that's the one way to demarcate them. And I think some of the recent work we've done, we've always put in an introduction of some sort, in the sense of you're always trying to put out your rationale for what you're doing. And I don't know if this is something that's particularly nuanced to psychology or not, because I happen just to have worked more with psychologists on the topic. But in that sense of you kind of want to know why you've made those decisions, how you put that forward, not just set out the decisions and what citation that there is coming to that. So I tend to find a protocol more satisfying when it's got some of that emerging understanding included to support the kind of method or the specific protocol itself. Part of what we did then was speak to participants about this within the consent form and engage with it. And this project was all about teachers' engagement with research. So we were talking about the topic as well as researching it when we were doing the consent forms and the focus groups and the interviews. So it made it for a very nice home with people who were receptive to think about research, evidence and education, which is a very big thing in the UK to do with higher education and teacher education in particular. So that supported an easy engagement and kind of conversation. In two other projects that we've done since then, which are under the exploratory case study. So this is where it's kind of qual dominated, but we have a specific quantitative survey in the middle of it. Within these, which is the Well Schools project and the Growth Areas project, we have a kind of team-based approach that uses a multiple range of methods. So in Well Schools, we've had secondary analysis, sorry, that's not the right word. We've had kind of document analysis, as well as interviews, as well as surveys, and a whole kind of tapestry of knowledge that comes together to form the case study. And that's quite a collaborative approach. So there we were working with 10 schools out of a network of just over 1,000 schools in the UK that are established and identify as well schools within their school, and they're kind of public about it. So that involved collaborating with these external partners, and a lot of it was unfolding and shaping during the project. In the same way, the Growth Areas project, we worked with a smaller number of schools, 7, who are all in different circumstances and all are being supported by the Youth Sport Trust for particular reasons. And there we've also got a team-based approach, but the team also involves the Youth Sport Trust in a great deal and their regional support networks, their regional managers with these schools. So in both instances, these have a range of multiple methods that are put in place. And by having a protocol that we then update during the design making process and at particular junctures, that's the best way of being open and transparent about it. For the growth areas, the one on the right-hand side that's got coming soon on it, the report should be launched later this month, all being well. And we've included a qual pre-registration within that for one particular pupil voice area when we had a bespoke measure that was designed and included in it. So this is where when something's identified as part of the project, but you can't design it until you're through a certain layer of the kind of bigger part of the case study, it's very nice to have that evolving, updating model. And that's how we frame it, is an evolving, updating protocol model, which is very different from the language in some of the other works. So if I look at some works, they call it a deviation from the research protocol. Now, a deviation is quite a strong heading to use. An update is kind of, there's an attraction to that. There's, there's an idea of putting clarity in place. It's helpful. Whereas a deviation from the protocol almost sounds like it's got consequences and negativity. So I do find it very interesting, and I'm trying to trace part of that argument and look it up to understand it a bit better. Because I think it's an interesting framing to continue with, particularly when we've got lots of emphasis on being human and kind of self-correction in science and self-correction in publication. So the fact that we're still calling it deviation is, to me, is challenging, but I don't know if it's just a personal challenge. That's something that I find difficult, or is it something else about just the language selection that's there? So these projects, we've just used the open OSF pages to do all of this. And what we're going to do for dissemination is have a Figshare account for the growth areas one. And that allows us to have that meeting of the two worlds between research and education in particular, making it easy to pick up these reports and engage with them. Because that's the one thing that we found, is that the OSF pages are fine for academics who are used to working their way through materials, but it's different for a different audience who it's not as easiest thing to get involved in. So what I want to think then is to move this conversation on to the idea of kind of peer review and the expectations there. Some of you here are listening to me might not ever have to engage with qualitative research. It's not your area. It's not what you find yourself affiliated towards for your research question. But something that's different in the qualitative world, particularly for peer review, is the assumption that open data is always possible. So, for example, I work with a whole range of individuals who do minority language education in Scotland, which is different projects, time for a different day. But essentially, is if I was to have open data, I would have to anonymise it so much that it would almost be redundant in terms of what I was putting online. So the data sharing there, it really has to be bounded in some way. And it has to be carefully handled. So it's working with journals who want to engage with you, even though it seems to be not available to the public. And that's for qual, it's a particular challenge there, and how that comes together. Now, the pre-registration model, I spoke a little bit about it, but I like to put on the introduction. I like to put in that background at the start of it. It suits me, it helps my writing, it helps the research process, it helps me challenge my own openness and my own expectations throughout the research journey. But that model will not suit every qualitative approach. I'm speaking as a psychologist. I tend to be positive or positivist or post-positivist in my approaches. And I tend to find things like grounded theory quite difficult, but that doesn't mean I can't value them. But I also think that a strict pre-registration model of you put it online once won't suit all of that plurality of the qualitative methods exactly. So this is where not engaging with pre-registration is not a problem. It is actually a positive thing if people can argue why it is the case and explain it. So I think there's an expectation of, if you're working with a journal who does often engage with open research, can you explore that argument in a couple of sentences in your paper? And that would be really warranted. Now, openness across the research process is also coming to the gear. We're seeing lots and lots of changes in the UK, in Europe. We're seeing lots of changes in the States as to what their expectations are. So there are very much communities at work here, where everybody's having to have a sea change of their behaviour. And within that, part of it is what are we writing to in our peer review. For qualitative work, it can feel particularly challenging to think about all of these varieties of areas that I introduced earlier on, and how do we respond to that. So in a peer review, do your best, be kind, be the person you normally are, help to give a final decision, do I find this persuasive or not, or I don't, it hasn't had enough transparency reported here. But also, if this is not something I'm very comfortable with, this analysis approach or this data collection method, tell the editor. They can go off and couple your review with someone else. So in that sense, support the readership, because what you're experiencing there, someone else will experience when they come to read the paper at another time. So that's the one way to accommodate it. Now, within the qualitative world as well, we don't often have the same kind of reviewer guidelines. So there is sometimes a kind of self-induction that you have to go through with the journal, the different expectations, and coming to the gear and being able to explain some of these kind of qualities and understandings. So I do things like I list points. It sounds formulaic, but it helps be very specific about what I've liked or what I haven't liked, rather than write lots and lots of long paragraphs. And I think it's working so far. That's what I would characterise that. Within peer review as well, I really like this diagram from a UKRI report, which is all about the spectrum of questionable research practices. So you can think of things as being less than perfect, or being real world research, or I think the language they use in that paper might also be suboptimal. So it's things that aren't perfect, but they're not problematic either. And this spectrum, I think, is a really good way of looking at it, because you hear the phrase questionable research practice and it sounds like you are a deviant, you're devious, you're doing something deliberately. But the reality is we are human. We make mistakes. We are incredibly time poor as academics. You can choose the wrong word in something, and that accidental errors, misunderstanding, shouldn't be damning whatever you're working with. You should be able to explain what that is. So I like to use this kind of graph when you're thinking about it, because all of that is pliable and qualitative world. But how problematic is it, is different from fabrication, which is where we think questionable research practices live. Within the educational research world, this is also really challenging when we're working with teachers and educators, in the sense that they live in a quite marketized world where everything is fad driven, or there's money supported and thrown at a particular area. So with the last kind of 20 years, you can look at different hallmarks of these things happening in the educational world as well. So they're very sometimes on the apprehensive side of misunderstandings and very wary of research evidence. So having a transparent model is allowing that trust and that bridge to be built between these two worlds, rather than having people move away from looking at research evidence. So a lot of what I said comes down to some really sound examples from the text there. So things like the first article is about promoting transparency in papers. There's the JARS, the Journal Article Reporting Standards, which you can drive people towards, even if they're not a psychologist, because you can trace that back to humanities AERA expectations from 20 years ago. A lot of it's embedded in that. The idea of kind of the qualitative methods and the primers, and writing effective peer review comments. So if there's at all any hesitancy about how to put these things together, it's really worth thinking about. One of the challenges within the qualitative world is that you have a researcher who's not familiar with qualitative work, and they strip away all the strengths of your qualitative work. So things that are very challenging is you're asked to give the frequency counts of your codes, or the frequency accounts of how many people spoke to this aspect of your thematic analysis map. And that's introducing a kind of codification and quantification approach to it, when as if you're doing a semantic analysis of some kind, it's not about the frequency, it's taking away from the qualitative epistemology altogether. So some of these are quite in tune and entwined, how they all come together and what that looks like. And I think when we're thinking about not separating the quant and the qual, it's understanding these gaps is really needed. What's curious is if we go to the ref panel statement from 2021, we have some language there that's talking about reports and pre-registration. and it's thinking about reproducibility. So that's what was in place for the last one. So that's just one example. And there's lots of examples like mine that were engaged with before that point that showed that qualitative protocols and the kind of hijacking the quantitative approach to doing it could absolutely be plausible and it be effective to drive your work. When we look at the next ref, which again is still developing and evolving, here we have a much longer statement. And again, it's thinking about open research practices. So we've gone to this wider framing. So there is a kind of universal expectations that this applies and these ideas apply to everyone in every area and every instance. So it's a research culture for the whole sector. And I think that's really important where this will only help you in some sense of your work if you're continuing to be an academic in the UK and in particular other areas. So within that, if you are new to this, it doesn't matter what your discipline is. I've chosen, I think there's about 11 examples there that I found, which all link to an article that's talking about the guidance to do with qualitative work, or it's qualitative and quantitative guidance for that area. Sometimes they don't split them up very finely, which is absolutely okay. So this is all about open qualitative research and thinking about being informed about it to some degree. And I very much, when I look at this, I think about it as a journey, as a process where on it, we're trying to engage with it. You don't have to be perfect at it from the get-go. It's not about getting all of those open research badges at all. It's just about working with the content and seeing how it might apply to the work that you've got planned for now and the work that's coming up. As well, when we're thinking about that knowledge and who we're working with, we've got the 2025 preprint for the transparency and openness guidance. So this kind of what we're expecting journals to engage with. And what's different there is that the common labelling that we're used to in terms of reproducibility, replicability, all of these headings and their meaning, they've now changed. I would say the kind of common labelling is being updated and the language is more open and it will be more applicable to qualitative as well as the quantitative expectations of replication is only for quantitative. So all of the associated practices that we're beginning to see there's going to be a change in the next 5 years because they'll probably last for 10 years, I think. This guidance and how it comes together. So for journal editors, for our communities, for the funders that we engage in, we will see, I don't know if it'll be a slow or a fast evolution, but I think there will be a change coming up. The 2024 survey is really a worldwide survey. I don't know what countries they didn't miss, but it's got Europe and the States, Africa, and so on and so on. And it's talking about the open research, the open science policy and guidance in these countries and the uptake. So that's a really informed perspective of if my work is in a different country or if I'm engaging with a different country about work, what are they doing? Do I have to convince them to adopt all of my open research practices, or is there something in their country that I can align the work with and help to create that bridge between ourselves as well? Generally speaking, open research has had quite an evolution in academia. I'm in humanities, so it has really changed in the last 5 years, which is great. But there are still those who are resistant to it or don't see the extra work as being much value for them. What we're also seeing is this embargo of peer-reviewed material being able to be picked up by people much more rapidly and quickly. So if I think of things like your research pages in academia, you don't have to be then having a separate research page with all of the material on it that people can access. It will just be allowing this immediate exchange between us and others once it's peer-reviewed, unless you choose to do a peer print. All of these open access kind of mandates that are coming through are also being driven by some of these country norms. So the open science policy within a country will also be fueling that. But it does look very different around the world. And within the UK, we don't have a set standard. So for example, I'm working at Manchester. They endorse using Figshare for putting any kind of data sets and things like that out. If I go to Leeds or if I go to Birmingham or Glasgow, whatever you name it, we have a different way of doing it. So we are a confused marketplace that doesn't really have a set standard for how we're doing it across the UK. So we do make it more difficult than it needs to be for us to actually exchange with each other and learn from these kind of things. Particularly if you try to go off and find a qualitative protocol or a qualitative such and such, it can often take a lot of wading to get to that point. There are kind of couple, the International Journal of Qualitative Methods has a whole section where they just publish protocols. So if you want to get away from the open OSF, get to something else, you can go and see a whole range of different protocols and how they're enacted there. That's the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. What I also want to speak about are kind of this idea of awareness raising and bringing things together as well. So Hostler's article's been circulated a lot, maybe you've seen it. But open research, open science comes with a burden of time, of learning about it, sharing about it, understanding it better, engaging it with it again when it changes and it evolves. And the workload that's involved with that, for you don't just do a piece of project and do the ethics and publish it, but it's all of these other layers of work that are not always evident to a lay person, to the person at your promotions committee, and so on and so forth, is very different. It's very difficult to articulate. So articles like this are really helpful to point to take away the debate away from you and your work, to actually saying, if you're wanting us to engage with this open research, we have to also then accommodate it within these expectations of us as academics on what that involves. And I think it's a really interesting one to be opening up those conversations, because you're challenging some norms about doing good work, because if it has all of this additional qualities and additional expectations and just the hours that requires. We did a little bit of project about some of this at Manchester, where we had a report of a qualitative survey that we sent round, and we pulled together a range of different, a collection of sorts of videos pre-recorded about qualitative methods and applications, teasing out some of these considerations and understandings as well, and teasing out some of the barriers and also the supportive factors when you're engaging with some of these worlds. So part of that is trying to encourage people to reflect and also think about what are the opportunities ahead. That was now 2 years ago. I think if we did that project again, we'd find a lot of different things, because things have evolved and the language and the visibility of open research has really come on in that short period quite significantly. So just to round up here, the other thing about knowledge and community building is the partners that we work with. So that's our student partners, and that's also the partners we have who we conduct and engage with for research reasons. This is all about expectations with research students, this next slide. So it's really thinking about what engagement that we can create when we're working with students on projects. So if you think about the open research movement in itself, it's created a series of changes in research practices and expectations, and also research culture. We've got adoption taking place quite dramatically in different disciplines at different times. And this is about kind of future researchers and encouraging them to have those expectations as well. So we're looking at students completing a research project, and within that, they're thinking about the relevancy and potential impact of their work, and they create kind of content for a website that shares that with a range of different audiences. So it's about understanding impact and understanding research relevance. And it's also about democratizing what research looks like when you're a student. That's often one of the biggest barriers, is you can find hundreds of published perfected journal articles that have gone through this whole journey, and that's what I mean by polished. They're their person's best work. Whereas when you're a student and you're learning, you are on a similar trajectory, but it's up to you to polish and perfect it. And sometimes that anxiety takes over. So by democratizing some of that content, we're opening up these conversations. We're encouraging this bridge for people to identify as research could be a career for me. I can see how this will have value. I can see what this will mean for the different communities that I want to, be the knowledge broker with them and engage with them. So we've got a kind of straightforward means to put that bridge in place. and it's a really nice entity. So we've got about half a dozen programs in Manchester affiliated and aligned with this. And the next couple of months, we're building on some of other faculties being involved and contributing as well. So the kind of accessibility and presentation of that is also built on kind of open access standards as well. You know, each entry, each summary on the web page is its own URL. So you can share it easily, you can be inspired, you can use it to speak to potential researchers. So I won't go into depth about much of that, but there's a lot of qualitative examples in it, which speaks to the interest in qualitative and open access of these kind of materials. And I think when we bring this together, you begin to recognise that some of these ideas are trying to think about how we're encouraging ourselves, how we're learning, but how we're also supporting individuals in all different disciplines to keep forward with open research. I think within psychology, there's lots of different ways to do a dissertation that have an open research element, whereas this sharing students projects approach allows for independent projects or group projects and other kind of content as well. Now, all of the kind of work that I've referred to today that I've highlighted that I'm involved in involves quite big teams. So I put up the links there to give an acknowledgement to all the hard work of the teams that I work with. So I'll round up here, or I could speak for ages about lots of different considerations, because there's so much about open research and qualitative worlds. So I'll be quiet now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was indeed informative, and thank you very much for sharing your insights so generously. So helpful. Yeah, I'm really glad that we've been recording this because it's hard to digest at once. It's so full, it's so packed of stuff, information. Thank you. So, dear audience, if you have any questions, I could go ahead with one. So, yeah, I was interested, and please forgive my ignorance. But so, if you've already covered this, especially, so how the protocols and pre-registration would work with this non-linear approach? So, unlike as you've discussed in one of your slides.
So the pre-registration model, if I look at any of the OSF pre-registration forms, the idea is you fill it out, you pre-register, and then you've got this fixed date and time, if that makes sense. And then anytime you want to change that, it's a deviation. And there's a different couple of ways that there's you can record the deviations. You know, it's just keeping like a logbook that you would do as a journal entry, then including that as a table at the end and explaining things. But it does mean that you've then got a public record that's kind of inaccurate from the pre-registration. So I think the OSF has allowed an updating part of the pre-registration model so that you can frequent that, which I think is really relevant if you've got a project of a certain size, it would suit it. What we've chosen to do because of the exploratory case studies, you don't know of the timing of that, if that makes sense. It's an inherent part of the design that you cannot predict at what point you'll need to update things. So rather than create a very, very messy series of pre-registrations, we've kind of had an initial protocol document, and then we've added on to it the different elements as they've evolved and been finished. But one of the firm approaches to it is that it gets put on the OSF before data collection, if that makes sense. And that was our personal way of splitting it, which is now we get to finish the design, it's done, it's agreed. And you use that as a sign-off point within the team. Whereas other projects, you could have even things changing, you know, after a pilot stage and then go back to it and change it again. So you can create systems in your plans to do all of these kind of things. For me, it's just the idea of a deviation is quite difficult. I think a deviation is like great for a systematic review. You know, you've got a very delineated plan, you're going off to execute it, and then you realise there's a different database that you can go into, or something else becomes available. That's a genuine deviation. Whereas the idea of having to call an evolving project, having lots of deviant elements, just seems it just seems an archaic term to use, when an updating model, I think, is how we like to frame it, is you're being honest and transparent of this is what we knew then, this is what we know now, and that's an entirely accurate way of reflecting and engaging with it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I was also interested with your review hats on. So the criteria for document selection from the open research perspective. So would you share any insights?
Sorry, can you say that to me again? So that was requirements for the document.
Document selection criteria. Yeah, like in a call paper.
So what do you mean by a document selection? That's what I'm not following.
When you, as your data, you use some documents.
Oh, so if I'm thinking of the worlds that I engage in just now, I might be having, like if I'm working with a school, I might have lots of policies as documents. I might have a handbook of best practice that a teacher in physical education is supposed to endorse. So all of those can be a form of document analysis. If you're working, say, in public health, you might have different policies or local knowledge and guidance, and they could all form one of document analysis as well. So it gives you two different perspectives on things sometimes as well. You know, what are they asking for and how is it understood? You know, and you get to appraise both by making that comparison. So that's where the real world research comes into its own, because you get the individual's experience who are living and engaging with it or ignoring things if they don't like it, and allows you to tease it out. Which I think gives it an extra kind of a set of affordances, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and as a reviewer or as a recipient of review, so how would you handle situations when just to make sure that the document selection for analysis was unbiased?
Oh, I wonder how you would argue. I wonder how you'd put that together. I think sometimes well, I think it's how you treat it as primary or secondary data. I think that's the one way to look at it. Is perhaps, and it might be an artificial separation. You know, some things that are kind of published. You know, if I'm thinking of, you know, like COPE publishing ethic committee guidance, there'll be a web page with an upload and a PDF or something with a DOI. It's very traceable. And you might be able to argue why we're looking at that versus not a local publication or something else instead, that, you know, it's drawn from. Whereas if I think, and that's that way, whereas if I think of other local knowledge that could be biased or seem to be biased, it could be, but it depends on how much you articulate that in the in terms of how you're qualifying the data that's collected. And there's some people who do a kind of when they look to archive all their material and engage with it, they would say, well, which was the primary data source, which was the secondary, which is a different separation as to how much influence it's had. Other people reject that way of looking at qualitative data because it doesn't reflect very well on their epistemology that they're adopting. But that leads us into a very extended conversation about coding, code books, archiving, and data handling in general, which you can tell why with only about 40 minutes I didn't go on at length about that, because it really had a lot of attention on it.
Yeah, which brings me to the next question, because you did mention that data sharing may not be always applicable in call research, but what about code books?
So code books, I think you could do. It gets very interesting where people often put in an example of a code book, and I've done that, you know, or a theoretical framework, because that's the most relevant bit of supplementary information to publish with the journal article. So you know everything related to this framework. It didn't matter how it was executed. It all had this as a home. There was something to refer to. So code books are a good way of doing that. I think as well, if you're using computer analysis of some kind, it should be easy to extract a form of a code book. And that does get interesting when you work with teams who work with qualitative analysis, because are they interested in having inter-rater examinations and conversations, or are they not? And again, that does vary within teams and how they operate things. You know, are they looking to have those expectations, or is it that we're identifying it slightly differently, but we're both working on the same sources? So code books lead into a lot of these questions, but how often you would see all of those questions answered in a qualitative piece is incredible. If I had to go and try and find you one paper that did all of that, I don't know how easy it would be to pick one out. And what I'd like to go to is I've ended up going to like the Harvard database. I think they called it Hardverse, because of the open access requirements that the USA is now enforcing everybody have by a certain date next year. There's been a huge change in how they're putting it together and how they organise it. Whereas if I go around looking at UK groups and trying to pick out something, I could be there 2 or 3 days and I wouldn't find something that satisfied the question I was looking up. So it is hard. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, probably the last one for me, because it's quite topical. So the use of AI, the ethical use of AI,
Yes.
and reviewer expectations around that.
I think it's interesting. So the last time I looked at AI was in the CADEX programs and seeing what they were doing, and they were sharing that it was quite good. They were using it as a good market research exercise. So if you were doing qualitative research for market research purposes, use our research and it will automatically find out the key things you need to know to sell to that market. Since then, so that was about 9 months ago, since then, I know there's been a publication over the summer to do with AI and a very rigorous examination of what AI can achieve through coding, but I haven't read it yet. It's on my list. But I think the main message from it was it can work, but it takes a lot of preparation, I think. So I don't know, I don't know, did they use inductive, deductive, or a hybrid approach or anything? You know, how much information did they feed into the AI? And that seems to be one of the determining ingredients with AI from what I've learned so far. And I'm very much a novice. I really haven't engaged with it an awful lot. Whatever, you have to think about it as what order is the content of the recipe, the set instructions you're giving it, because that will determine what you get from it. So I think the level of control, if you're using AI, you almost need to be documenting everything that you gave it as instructions. But I don't know anyone as yet who's got the capacity as a reviewer to be able to appraise all of that. I think it would require quite a talent, you know, both knowing qualitative stuff inside out and also the AI computational language and what you put into those machines and what they come from it. So it's an interesting one. I think it can do it, but will it replace humans? Will it be able to do semantic and latent stuff? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm quite skeptical about it.
Yeah, I think to make it a short answer, on a surface level, I think you'd be fine. If you're asking it to look up science and it finds you a chemistry and a physics example, great. So as a quick search, but
Yeah.
whether it could actually then go into all the minutiae of that and recognize all of that, you'd have to teach it the language that could come up with that. So you're almost thinking it's as much work as doing having researchers work on it. So I don't know. I don't know. I think it's a new horizon, but when it's going to change things, I don't know.
Definitely, yeah. I can see some direct applications like coding in quant research. But yeah, it was interesting that I've started hearing people speaking about this in relation to qual research, which requires, in my humble opinion, requires a much stricter and critical approach. So, yeah.
Well, it's also, when we're thinking about the qualitative coding, you often have a question, this is what I did, what did you do? And I don't know if AI can examine itself. I don't know if it's got that introspection. Can it actually keep a record of the logs of what it did to get to its answer? Or does it produce an answer for you when you need an answer? Because of its computational mind, I don't know enough about it then. And I'm not a consciousness researcher, so I shouldn't say any more. But I think there's an element of, are we treating it, if we were treating it as a software, we could look at a software log, you know, I could look at the syntax of anything and trace decisions and what button was clicked or what option was enabled. And we should be able to do the same with AI, but I don't know if we can yet, unless you're an AI researcher and can go underneath the hood of the instrument, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So it's still developing. I guess at least in coal research, there's still some a need to catch up versus in coal there is a little bit more clarity. Just a couple of comments from our guests that it was super helpful because we have people in different stages of PhD, both starting and doing a mixed method, the exploratory one, with coal work informing the sequential quant study, and also someone finishing the coal PhD and thinking about future projects. So they found it very useful. Thank you very much. So I'm about to stop recording and right.